Across the shattered remains of Berlin, the thunder of artillery had finally fallen silent, leaving only the crackle of burning timber and the hollow echo of boots on rubble. For millions across Europe, May 1945 marked liberation, the end of a nightmare that had consumed the continent. But for a particular group of young women in tattered Luftwaffe auxiliary uniforms, their faces streaked with ash and exhaustion, this spring morning meant something very different. Their hands were raw from digging through debris, their bodies thin from months of rations that had dwindled to nearly nothing. They were radio operators, cipher clerks and searchlight coordinators, cogs in a military machine that had promised them glory, but delivered only hunger and ruin. Now, as American soldiers moved through the streets with rifles lowered, these women waited in tense silence, their minds crowded with images the Reich's propaganda had seared into their consciousness. They had been told what the Americans would do to them. They braced for it, hollow-eyed and trembling, as the conquerors approached. The women were gathered in the courtyard of what had once been a military communications center, now reduced to half-collapsed walls and twisted metal. An American officer, his uniform impossibly clean against the backdrop of devastation, called out orders in English none of them fully understood. They were counted, catalogued, their names recorded on clipboards with a methodical efficiency that felt alien after years of chaos. No one struck them. No one shouted. The absence of brutality was itself disorienting, a void where violence was expected. They were loaded onto trucks, canvas flapping in the wind, and driven through streets they barely recognized. Buildings that had stood for centuries were now skeletal frames. The smell of smoke clung to everything. At the railway station, they were herded into train cars, not cattle cars but passenger compartments with wooden benches and windows that still had glass. The journey westward took days, the landscape slowly transforming as they moved away from the heart of the Reich's collapse. Cities gave way to towns, then to countryside that bore fewer scars of war. And then, at a port they would later learn was Bremen, they saw the ships waiting in the harbor, grey and massive, flying the American flag. The women climbed aboard in silence, descending into holds that smelled of oil and salt. The engines rumbled to life, and the ship pulled away from Europe, from everything they had known, toward an uncertain fate across an ocean none of them had ever seen. The days at sea blurred together, marked only by the rhythm of waves and the twice-daily distribution of meals that shocked them into a stunned, guilty silence. On the second morning, as the ship rolled through swells beneath an overcast sky, they were led to a mess hall deep in the vessel's belly. The room was stark, utilitarian, but what waited on the metal trays felt like a hallucination born of desperation. Bread. Real bread. Not the dense grey blocks made with sawdust and potato flour they'd choked down for years, but soft white rolls that yielded under the slightest pressure. Butter sat in small paper cups beside them. There was porridge, thick and steaming, and canned fruit, peaches swimming in syrup that gleamed under the fluorescent lights. One woman, Ilse, 23 years old and formerly a cipher clerk in Hamburg, stared at her tray as if it might vanish. Her hands shook as she picked up the roll, felt its impossible softness compress between her fingers. She had not held bread like this since before the war, since childhood summers at her grandmother's house in the countryside. The first bite released a flood of warmth and flavor that nearly broke her. Around her, other women ate in silence, some with tears streaming down their faces, others with expressions of hollow disbelief. One whispered, "My sister died last winter. We had nothing, and here they feed us like this." No one responded. What could be said? The contradiction was too vast, too cruel in its implications. They had been promised degradation, and instead they were given bread and butter. It shook them to the core. As the days passed and the ship cut through the Atlantic, the women began to emerge from their initial shock into a state of numb observation. They were allowed on deck in shifts, supervised but not confined. The air was cold and clean, scrubbed of the smoke and rot that had saturated Berlin. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, grey-green and indifferent. Some women stood at the railing for hours, watching the water, trying to reconcile what was happening with what they had been taught to expect. Ilse found herself thinking of the propaganda films she'd watched in the auxiliary barracks, the ones that depicted Americans as brutal savages who would rape and murder prisoners without mercy. Yet here she was, fed and unharmed, sailing toward a continent the war had never touched. On the 8th day, land appeared on the horizon. The women were brought on deck to witness the approach to New York Harbor. The skyline rose before them like something from a fever dream, towers of steel and glass gleaming in the afternoon sun, utterly intact, utterly untouched by the devastation that had consumed their world. The Statue of Liberty stood in the water, green and massive, her torch raised in a gesture that felt like mockery or promise. Ilse couldn't decide which. She thought of the Reichstag in ruins, of Dresden's Baroque churches reduced to ash, and then looked again at this city that had never known a bomb. The contrast was so brutal it felt physical, a weight pressing on her chest. America was not only unscathed, it was flourishing, and they, the defeated, were being brought into its abundance as prisoners. The processing center was a warehouse near the docks, cavernous and echoing with voices in a dozen languages. The women were led through stations where officials checked their names against lists, photographed them, issued them numbers. Everything was organized, efficient, devoid of the chaos and cruelty they had braced for. At one station, they were handed bundles of clothing, simple grey dresses, undergarments, socks. An American woman with kind eyes and halting German explained they could shower and change. The word shower sent a ripple of fear through the group. They had heard stories, but they were too exhausted to resist, and they followed the woman down a corridor to a tiled room with rows of shower heads. The water was hot, impossibly, shockingly hot, pouring over their bodies in a cascade that felt like absolution they didn't deserve. Ilse stood beneath the stream, her skin prickling as warmth seeped into muscles that had been cold for longer than she could remember. There was soap, real soap, thick white bars that smelled faintly of lavender, not the harsh lye mixture they'd rationed back home. She lathered her hair, watched the water at her feet turn grey with months of grime, and felt something crack open inside her chest. This was not torture. This was not degradation. This was kindness, and it was unbearable. Hatred would have been easier. Hatred was simple. But this gentle restoration of dignity by the people she'd been taught to despise, left her defenseless. After the showers, they dressed in the clean clothes and were led to a dining hall. The smell hit them before they entered. Roasted meat, vegetables, bread, baking somewhere nearby. Inside, long tables were set with plates and utensils, and American soldiers stood behind serving counters, ladling food onto trays. The women moved through the line in stunned silence, receiving portions that seemed impossibly large. Boiled potatoes, carrots glistening with butter, beef stew, chunks of meat swimming in thick gravy, soft rolls, still warm, with real butter in small foil packets. Ilse sat at a table with the others, staring at her plate. She thought of the letters from her mother, the ones that had stopped coming months ago, but whose words she remembered with perfect clarity. "We boil weeds for soup. The ration cards are worthless. If you have anything, send it." She picked up her fork and took a bite of stew. The flavor exploded across her tongue, rich and savory, and so far removed from turnip soup and sawdust bread that it felt like a betrayal. Around her, women ate slowly, some crying openly, others with faces set in rigid masks. One woman pushed her plate away, unable to continue. Another ate everything and then sat with her hands pressed to her face, shoulders shaking. Ilse forced herself to finish, but the food sat in her stomach like lead, heavy with guilt. How could she eat this when her mother was starving? How could she accept such abundance from the enemy while her own nation had left its people to die? That night they were transported inland by train, watching through the windows as American towns rolled past. Houses with lights in the windows, cars parked in driveways, children playing in yards. Everything was normal. Everything was whole. The train carried them through farmland, past fields that stretched to the horizon, untouched by war. Ilse pressed her forehead against the glass and tried to comprehend the scale of what she was seeing. Germany was rubble and ash and hunger. America was this. The inversion gnawed at her, a slow erosion of everything she'd believed about the world. They arrived at the camp in the early hours of the morning. too exhausted to take in much beyond the tall fences and low wooden barracks arranged in neat rows. Guards, young men in American uniforms who looked barely older than the women themselves, directed them toward a large building at the camp's center. Inside, they were separated into smaller groups and led to different sections. Ilse found herself in a line with perhaps 20 other women, all of them swaying with fatigue, eyes red from crying or sleeplessness or both. An American woman in a crisp uniform, her blonde hair pinned back, stood at the head of the line with a clipboard. She spoke in careful, accented German, explaining that they would be assigned to barracks and given bedding. The word bedding registered dimly, but Ilse was too tired to process it fully. The line moved slowly, each woman stepping forward to receive a bundle of fabric from another American woman behind a counter. When Ilse's turn came, she held out her arms and felt the weight of cloth placed into them. She looked down. Sheets, cotton bed sheets. 2 of them, folded and pressed, the fabric pristine white and impossibly soft under her fingers. For a moment, she couldn't understand what she was holding. The texture was wrong, too smooth, too fine. She ran her thumb across the weave and felt something inside her chest collapse. This was not burlap, this was not the coarse wool blankets they'd used in the auxiliary barracks, thin and scratchy and never quite warm enough. This was cotton, real cotton, the kind she remembered from her grandmother's house, from a world before the war had swallowed everything gentle and good. She pressed the sheets to her face without thinking, inhaling the scent of clean fabric and something faintly floral, maybe lavender from the soap used in washing them. The softness against her cheek was shocking, a sensory experience so far removed from years of hardship that it felt like stepping into someone else's life. Around her, other women were reacting similarly, some stroking the fabric with trembling fingers, others clutching the sheets to their chests, eyes wide and glassy. One woman began to cry, loud gasping sobs that filled the room and made the American women exchange uncertain glances. Ilse stood frozen, the sheets still pressed to her face, and felt the fortress of her beliefs begin to crack. They had been told the Americans would strip them of dignity, would humiliate and degrade them as the Reich had done to so many others. But here she was, holding cotton bed sheets that were softer than anything she'd touched in years, given to her not as a reward or privilege but as a basic provision, as if she were human and deserving of comfort. The contradiction was too vast to reconcile. How could the enemy show more care for her well-being than her own nation ever had? How could this simple gift of softness undo her more completely than any cruelty could have? That night, assigned to a bunk in one of the barracks, Ilse made her bed with the sheets she'd been given. The mattress was thin but clean, the frame sturdy. She smoothed the bottom sheet across it, tucking the corners with hands that still shook slightly, then spread the top sheet over herself as she lay down. The fabric settled over her body like a whisper, cool and impossibly gentle against her skin. She turned onto her side, pulling the sheet up to her chin, and for the first time in months she felt warm. Not from heat, but from the simple comfort of being cared for, however impersonally. Around her in the dark barracks, she could hear other women shifting in their bunks, some sniffling quietly, others already breathing with the slow rhythm of sleep. Ilse closed her eyes and thought about writing in her diary, the small leather-bound book she'd hidden in her bag during processing. But she was too exhausted, and the words she needed didn't exist yet. Instead, she drifted into sleep wrapped in softness and dreamed of her grandmother's house in summer. The days settled into a rhythm marked by bells and meals and work assignments that felt surreal in their mundane normalcy. Each morning, a bell rang at 6, and the women rose from their bunks, folding the cotton sheets with a care that bordered on reverence. They dressed in their grey dresses, pinned their hair back and filed out to the washrooms where hot water ran from taps and soap, sat in dishes by every sink. Breakfast was served in the mess hall, oatmeal with milk and sugar, toast with jam, sometimes eggs scrambled and fluffy, sometimes bacon that filled the room with a smell so rich and decadent it felt criminal. Ilse ate slowly, savouring each bite, but the guilt never left. It sat in her stomach alongside the food, a constant reminder of the people she'd left behind. After breakfast, work assignments were distributed. The women were divided into groups based on skills or simply alphabetical order. Some were sent to the camp laundry, others to the kitchens or gardens. Ilse, because of her background in communications, was assigned to a small office where she helped organize files and translate documents. The work was light, nothing like the exhausting shifts in the communications bunker back in Hamburg, where she decoded messages for 12 hours at a stretch. Here she sat at a desk with a window that looked out onto the camp's main yard, and she sorted papers while American officers came and went, nodding politely if they caught her eye. The strangeness of it all never diminished. She was a prisoner, technically, but the bars were invisible. There were fences, yes, and guards at the gates, but within the camp's boundaries, life had a strange approximation of freedom. The women could walk the grounds during free periods, sit beneath trees in the yard, even play cards in the barracks at night. There was a canteen where they could use scrip, camp currency they earned from their work, to buy small luxuries: chocolate bars, cigarettes, pencils and paper, lipstick even, which some of the younger women bought with trembling hands, as if touching such a thing might wake them from a dream. One afternoon, Ilse stood in line at the canteen, the scrip she'd earned folded in her palm. When her turn came, she stared at the items displayed behind the counter, overwhelmed by the abundance of choice. Finally, she pointed to a Hershey bar, its brown wrapper gleaming under the lights. The American man running the canteen handed it to her with a smile and said something in English she didn't understand, but that sounded kind. She took the chocolate and walked back to her barracks, holding it like a relic. In her bunk, she unwrapped it carefully, breaking off a single square. The sweetness flooded her mouth and she closed her eyes, remembering childhood birthdays, her father bringing home sweets from the shop in Hamburg before rationing began. She had not tasted chocolate in 4 years. The joy of it was excruciating. At night, lying in her bunk beneath the cotton sheets that still felt like a miracle against her skin, Ilse would take out her diary and write by the light of a small lamp. The entries were fragmented, half-formed thoughts she couldn't yet organize into coherence. They give us food like we are guests, not prisoners. The sheets are soft, I do not understand. She wrote about the guilt, about the letters from home that had stopped coming, about the fear of what her family must be enduring while she slept in comfort. If they knew where I was, if they knew how I lived, would they hate me? Would I hate myself? One evening, a letter arrived. The American officer who delivered it handed it to Ilse without ceremony, just a thin envelope with her name written in her mother's handwriting. She took it to her bunk and sat with it unopened for nearly an hour, afraid of what it might contain. When she finally tore it open, the words swam before her eyes, and she had to read them 3 times before their meaning settled. My dearest Ilse, we have not heard from you in months and pray you are safe. The city is worse than before. We boil weeds for soup when we can find them. Your father's ration card was stolen, and he grows weaker. The apartment has no windows, and winter is coming. If you have anything at all, send it, your loving mother. Ilse folded the letter and pressed it against her chest, her throat closing with a grief so profound it felt like drowning. That night, she couldn't eat. She sat in the mess hall as the other women consumed plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, bread rolls gleaming with butter, and she stared at her untouched food with something close to hatred. How could she eat this when her father was dying of hunger? How could she accept the enemy's abundance while her family scraped weeds from between rubble? The Americans had given her cotton sheets and chocolate and safety, and in doing so, they had made her complicit in a betrayal she couldn't name but felt in every fiber of her being. Some began to feel shame heavier than chains. They were enemies, yet here they were fed, clothed, sheltered. The Reich had demanded their loyalty, sent them to operate radios and decode messages, but gave them hunger and ruins in return. America, the sworn enemy, gave them cotton bed sheets and hot water and meals that made them weep. This inversion gnawed at their souls, unspoken but ever present. The guards, for their part, seemed as unsettled by the arrangement as the women were. Ilse noticed it in the way they watched the prisoners, not with the hard suspicion she'd expected, but with something closer to confusion or pity. One guard, a young man from Ohio whose name tag read Thompson, stood outside the barracks during evening rounds, his rifle slung over his shoulder more out of habit than necessity. Ilse passed him one night on her way back from the washroom, and he nodded at her, then said in halting German, "You okay?" The question was so unexpected, so absurdly gentle, that she could only nod in return. He smiled, a small awkward thing, and continued his rounds. Later, she would learn that Thompson had written to his mother about the women in the camp, describing them not as enemies but as girls, some younger than his own sister, who looked at the guards as if expecting a blow that never came. The letter, which one of the American officers read aloud during a meeting Ilse later heard about second-hand, had said, "They are not what we were told. They are thin and scared, and when you give them food, some of them cry. I don't know what we're supposed to do with that." The difficulty of reconciling propaganda with reality became a shared burden. The women had been taught that Americans were beasts, savages without culture or morality, and yet here they were, offering cotton sheets and kindness. The cognitive dissonance created a kind of internal war, a battle between memory and present experience, between what they'd been told and what they were living. Ilse captured it in her diary, with painful clarity. To be treated with dignity by those we were told were beasts, it is harder than hatred. Hatred is easy, dignity is unbearable. The weeks turned to months, and the routines of camp life became familiar, in a way that felt both comforting and deeply wrong. Ilse worked in the office, translating documents and organizing files with a competence that earned her small nods of approval from the American officers. During breaks, she would walk the camp's perimeter, watching the guards who watched her, both parties trapped in roles neither fully understood. The fence that separated them seemed increasingly symbolic, a line drawn by nations at war, but eroding under the weight of daily human interaction. One afternoon while working, Ilse dropped a stack of files and papers scattered across the floor. She knelt to gather them, cheeks burning with embarrassment, when Thompson appeared beside her and crouched down to help. They worked in silence for a moment, hands brushing accidentally as they reached for the same document. He said something in English, then tried again in broken German. "Is okay. Happens." She looked at him. This young man who was supposed to be her enemy, and saw only another person caught in the machinery of war, doing a job he probably didn't fully believe in. For a brief second, two enemies shared a moment of simple human kindness across a gulf the war had declared unbridgeable. Music became another unexpected bridge. Some of the women had smuggled instruments, a harmonica, a small accordion, and on quiet evenings they would play familiar songs from home. One night, as Ilse sat in the yard listening to a melody her grandmother used to hum, she heard an American voice join in. One of the guards was singing along, stumbling over the German words but capturing the tune perfectly. The women turned to stare, and the guard, realizing what he'd done, shrugged sheepishly and said in English something that made the others laugh. Later, Ilse learned he'd grown up in a German-speaking community in Pennsylvania, had sung those same songs as a child. The war had made them enemies, but music remembered they were human first. The camp administration began allowing work details outside the fence, supervised excursions to nearby farms and factories where labor was needed. Ilse was assigned to a group that helped with the apple harvest at an orchard 20 miles from the camp. They rode in the back of a truck, canvas flapping in the September wind, and watched America roll past through the gap in the tailgate. The landscape was stunning in its wholeness. Farmhouses with fresh paint, barns full of hay, fields stretching to distant tree lines without a single crater or ruin. Children played in yards waving at the passing truck. Women hung laundry on lines. Life, normal and uninterrupted, flowed around them like a river that had never known drought. At the orchard, they were given baskets and shown which apples to pick. The work was hard but satisfying, the sun warm on their backs, the smell of ripe fruit thick in the air. During lunch, local women from a nearby church brought sandwiches and lemonade, setting up tables beneath the trees and serving the German prisoners with smiles and broken attempts at German greetings. Ilse bit into a ham sandwich on soft white bread and tasted mayonnaise, lettuce, thick slices of meat. She thought of her mother's letter, of weeds boiled into soup, and the contrast was so obscene she nearly choked. One of the American women noticed her distress and touched her shoulder gently, saying something soothing in English. Ilse nodded, swallowed, forced herself to continue eating. "This is paradise," she thought, "and I am here while they starve." The guilt was a physical weight, crushing her from the inside. Imagine the weight of that moment. To taste butter after years of sawdust bread, to feel full when your family starves across the ocean. If you've ever experienced a moment where kindness felt harder to accept than cruelty, share your thoughts in the comments below. On the ride back to camp, the women were quiet, each lost in her own thoughts. That night, in the barracks, someone broke the silence that had become their collective defense. "Perhaps," she said, voice barely above a whisper, "perhaps our nation lied to us." The words hung in the air, dangerous and undeniable. No one responded immediately, but the silence that followed was different, heavier, full of admissions no one was ready to speak aloud. Ilse lay in her bunk beneath the cotton sheets that had become both comfort and accusation, and stared at the ceiling. Who are the beasts now? The question circled in her mind, unanswerable and relentless. The physical transformation was impossible to ignore. Over the months, the women's bodies had changed, filling out as they gained weight from regular meals and rest. Faces that had been gaunt and grey now carried colour. Hair that had been dull and brittle regained lustre. Some women looked younger, as though captivity had peeled away years of war's erosion. Ilse saw it in herself when she caught her reflection in the washroom mirror. The hollows beneath her cheekbones had filled. Her skin had regained some elasticity. Her eyes were less sunken. She looked almost like the girl she'd been before the war, before hunger and fear and propaganda had reshaped her into something harder and more desperate. The recognition was unbearable. It forced her to confront how deeply the Reich had failed them, how the nation that demanded absolute loyalty had offered nothing but suffering in return. The enemy had made them healthy. The enemy had fed them, clothed them, treated them with a baseline dignity their own government had stripped away. Each bar of chocolate chipped away at the fortress of belief. Each soft cotton sheet undermined the propaganda's foundation. It was not a clash of armies, but a slow erosion of conviction, and it left Ilse feeling unmoored, adrift in a world where certainty had dissolved into questions with no answers. Autumn had turned, though time inside the wire felt strangely fluid, its passage marked less by calendars than by the rhythm of meals, work, and letters from home that arrived with increasing rarity. Yet beneath the routine, something profound had taken root. For months the women had lived with the shock of survival in America, their days filled with cotton sheets and hot water, and food that made them weep. But now came the harder reckoning, what all of this meant for who they had been and who they might become. The women faced an impossible question. What do you owe a nation that demanded everything but gave you nothing? And what do you owe an enemy who gave you dignity when your own country gave you ruins? There's no easy answer. If this story is challenging what you thought you knew about war, about loyalty, about human nature, let us know in the comments. And if you want to hear more untold stories like Ilse's, subscribe and turn on notifications. Ilse sat on her bunk one cold November evening, diary balanced on her knees, the barracks quiet around her. She wrote, "I have eaten more in captivity than in all the final year of the Reich. I have slept without fear of bombs, wrapped in sheets softer than anything I remember from before the war. And yet my heart is not at peace. What kind of world is it where the enemy shows more dignity than our own? Where kindness comes from those we were taught to hate, and cruelty from those who demanded our love?" Around her, some of the other women had adapted to camp life with an ease that bordered on forgetting. They laughed during card games, sang while they worked, spoke of the war as if it were already distant history. Ilse watched them and felt a deep loneliness. She could not join them in that lightness, could not shake the weight of knowing her comfort was built on her family's suffering. The cotton sheets that cradled her each night felt like an indictment, soft and accusing. The guards had stopped seeing them as enemies for the most part. Thompson brought them newspapers sometimes, translating headlines into his broken German. Another guard, an older man named Mitchell, shared cigarettes through the fence during his night rounds. Speaking in English they mostly couldn't understand, but in a tone that conveyed companionship. A sergeant wrote in a letter to his wife, "You'd forget for a minute they were the enemy if you didn't look at the uniforms. They're just girls trying to make sense of a world that's gone insane, same as us." The work details into nearby towns became more frequent as winter approached. Ilse found herself on a crew that helped winterize a park in a small city an hour from the camp. They raked leaves, wrapped young trees in burlap, prepared flower beds for the coming cold. During lunch, they sat on benches and ate sandwiches provided by local volunteers, watching American life flow past. Cars gleamed in the weak November sun. Shop fronts displayed goods in abundance, boots, coats, canned foods stacked in pyramids. A bakery across the street sent the smell of fresh bread drifting through the air, and Ilse closed her eyes, remembering the scent of her mother's kitchen before the war, before everything became ash and hunger. A woman emerged from the bakery with a box of pastries and crossed the street toward them. She spoke no German, but her gestures were clear as she offered the box around. Ilse took a cream-filled pastry, bit into it, and tasted sugar and butter and vanilla. The sweetness was overwhelming, and she thought of her mother's words, "We boil weeds for soup." How could she swallow this when her family gnawed bark and hoped for scraps? How could she accept this kindness when it came from the nation that had bombed her city to rubble? But she ate it anyway, because refusing wouldn't feed her mother, and because some part of her, a part she was ashamed to acknowledge, craved the sweetness, the normalcy, the brief illusion that the world could be gentle again. That night, back in the barracks, she lay beneath her cotton sheets and hated herself for being grateful. Conversations in the barracks had begun to shift, growing more honest as the months accumulated. One woman admitted she dreaded the thought of going home more than she'd feared being brought to America. Another confessed she'd stopped writing to her family because she couldn't find the words to describe where she was without sounding like she'd betrayed them. Ilse listened to these whispered admissions and recognized her own thoughts reflected back. The unspoken truth hung in the air. Captivity in America had given them something their own nation never had, and acknowledging that felt like treason. "I am afraid to go back," someone said one night, voice barely audible in the darkness. No one responded, but the silence was heavy with agreement. To return meant facing a landscape of ruin and hunger, meant explaining why they looked healthy when everyone else was starving, meant carrying the knowledge that the enemy had been kinder than the fatherland. It was an impossible burden, and they all felt it pressing down. In December, as the first snow began to fall, Ilse stood before the small mirror in the washroom and studied her reflection. Her face was fuller, her skin clear, her hair thick and shining. She looked like the girl in photographs from before the war, the one who'd smiled at birthday parties and dreamed of becoming a teacher. The transformation was almost complete, and it terrified her. How could she face her mother looking like this? How could she explain that prison in America had restored what the Reich had taken? Would they even recognize her, this well-fed daughter returned from the land of the enemy? The greatest shock, however, lay not in food or work, but in the mirror. The women's bodies had changed, faces filled out, hair regained its luster, color returned to cheeks. Some even looked younger, as though captivity had peeled away years of war. To see themselves restored in this way was almost unbearable. It forced them to recognize how deeply the Reich had failed them, how completely the nation that demanded everything had given nothing in return. Ilse returned to her bunk and opened her diary, the small leather book now more than half filled with entries that traced her transformation from captured enemy to something she couldn't quite name. She wrote, "I fear my mother's judgment more than I feared capture. If she could see me now, soft and clean and well-fed, while she boils weeds and watches father waste away, what would she say? Would she recognize me? Would she forgive me for living well while they died slowly? I do not know if I can forgive myself." The guilt was compounded by the strange paradox of captivity. She was imprisoned, but freer than she'd been in years. No bombs fell, no sirens wailed, no orders came to work until exhaustion claimed consciousness. The war continued somewhere beyond the fence, but inside life had a rhythm that felt almost normal, and that normalcy was its own kind of torment. How dare she feel safe when the world burned? How dare she sleep soundly wrapped in cotton when her family shivered in ruins? Ilse, staring once more at her diary, wrote the words she had never dared before. "I fear leaving more than I feared arriving." The confession chilled her, but it was honest, For the enemy's greatest weapon had not been guns or bombs. It had been cotton bed sheets and hot water, and meals served with a dignity she'd forgotten existed, and those things had done what hatred could not. They had changed her, reshaped her understanding of the world, and made her question everything the Reich had taught her to believe. The war would end. She would be sent home. But the girl who'd operated radios in Hamburg, who'd believed in the propaganda and the promises, that girl was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone who'd touched softness in the enemy's hands and could never unknow what that meant. Winter settled over the camp with a quiet brutality, frost coating the barracks windows each morning in delicate patterns that melted under the warmth of bodies and breath. The routines continued unchanged: bells, meals, work, sleep. But beneath the surface, tension accumulated. Rumors circulated of repatriations beginning, of ships being prepared to carry prisoners back to Europe. No official announcements came, but the whispers grew louder with each passing week, and the women lived in a state of suspended dread, knowing the temporary sanctuary of captivity would eventually end. On a morning in late January, the sky heavy with clouds that promised snow, the women gathered in the yard for morning count as usual. The cold bit through their coats, and their breath formed small clouds in the air. But something felt different. The guards stood more formally than usual, and the camp commander, a stern-faced colonel who rarely addressed the prisoners directly, stood at the front of the formation with a clipboard. He spoke in German, his accent thick but understandable. "Today we begin the process of repatriation. Names will be called. Those called will report to processing. You will return home." The words landed like stones dropped into still water, ripples of shock spreading through the assembled women. Ilse felt her heart hammering against her ribs, her hands clenched inside her coat pockets. This was what they'd known was coming, what they'd feared, and some part of her admitted, hoped might be delayed indefinitely. But now it was here, real and unavoidable. The colonel began reading names from his list, each syllable clear in the frozen morning air. Women stepped forward as they were called, faces blank with shock or resignation, or something harder to name. The list went on, 30 names, 40, 50. Ilse stood rigid, waiting, praying her name wouldn't come, knowing it would. Richter, Ilse. Every syllable landed like a thunderclap. She stepped forward on legs that felt disconnected from her body, joining the group of women whose names had sealed their fate. Around her, some wept quietly. Others stood with expressions of carved stone. The colonel finished the list, dismissed the formation, and the named women were led toward the processing building while the others watched in silence. In the processing room, they were given back the belongings they'd arrived with: worn bags, a few personal items, identification papers. Ilse held her small leather diary, its pages now filled with months of transformation documented in cramped handwriting. She tucked it into her bag and tried to breathe evenly, tried to quiet the panic rising in her chest. And as Ilse heard her name called, as she stepped forward into the cold morning light with the weight of her bag pulling at her shoulder, and the knowledge of what awaited settling over her like the snow that had begun to fall, she realized the true conflict was no longer between nations. It was inside her, in the space where hatred had once lived, and where something new, fragile, dangerous, undeniable had begun to take root. A loyalty not to flags or nations, but to the truth she'd learned in captivity, that even enemies are human. That dignity can come from unexpected hands. That the cotton sheets which had cradled her through months of transformation had done more than restore her body. They had dismantled every certainty the Reich had built inside her mind. She clutched her bag tighter, the leather diary pressed against her ribs through the fabric, and thought of the words she'd written the night before: "I do not know who I will be when I return." The girl who left Hamburg no longer exists. In her place stands someone the war could not have predicted. Someone who learned that kindness can be a weapon more devastating than any bomb, because it leaves you alive to carry the weight of what it means. The transport trucks waited beyond the fence, their engines rumbling in the frozen air. Ilse walked toward them with the other women, their breath forming clouds that dissipated into the grey morning. Behind them, the camp stood silent, its barracks and fences and routines continuing without them, already preparing for the next wave of prisoners who would arrive and be fed and given cotton sheets, and transformed in ways they couldn't yet imagine. What awaited her in Germany, she didn't know. Ruins, certainly. Hunger, undoubtedly. Her family, if they'd survived. And questions she had no answers for. Questions about where she'd been, what she'd eaten, why she looked healthy when the rest of the nation was dying. She would carry those questions, and the guilt, and the impossible knowledge that her enemy had shown her more humanity than her own country ever had. But she would also carry something else, something small and precious and dangerous, the memory of softness, of cotton against her skin, of dignity freely given, of a world where kindness existed even in captivity, even across the trenches of war. And that memory, she knew, would make her dangerous to any ideology that demanded she hate without question, follow without thinking, sacrifice without receiving even the basic recognition of her humanity in return. The truck's tailgate slammed shut. The engine roared, and as the camp disappeared behind them, Ilse pressed her hand against the cold metal wall and made a promise to herself. She would remember. She would remember the taste of butter, and the warmth of hot water, and the impossible softness of American cotton sheets. She would remember that the enemy had been kind, and she would never again believe anyone who told her that entire peoples were monsters, that war made cruelty inevitable, that hatred was the only honest response to those on the other side of a conflict she'd never chosen. The girl who'd operated radios for the Luftwaffe was gone. In her place sat a woman who'd learned the most subversive truth of all, that humanity persists even when nations demand we abandon it. And that truth, carried home in the heart of a former prisoner, was more dangerous to tyranny than any army could ever be. What happened to Ilse when she returned to Germany? Did her family forgive her for surviving in comfort while they starved? Could she ever reconcile the two versions of herself, the girl who believed the Reich's promises and the woman who'd learned that enemies could be kind? History doesn't record what became of most women like Ilse. Their stories disappeared into the chaos of post-war Europe, carried silently in hearts that had learned truths too complex for propaganda, too nuanced for the simple narratives nations prefer to tell about their wars. But the questions they lived with, about loyalty, about dignity, about what we owe those who show us kindness when we expect cruelty, those questions remain. If this story made you see war differently, made you question what you thought you knew about enemies and allies, share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you want to hear more stories like this, where history refuses to be simple and the line between right and wrong blurs in ways that still matter today, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Thanks for watching.